You're listening to Big Table, a podcast about books and conversation presented by Hat and Beard Press, Dub Lab, and Gold Diggers in Los Angeles. I'm your host, JC Gabel. For each episode, we speak to one author about a singular book in a long-form interview. Each interview is then followed by a brief reading, sometimes from the same book being discussed, sometimes by a like-minded title and a different author. But every episode does retain a loose theme throughout, and is inspired by the work of radio host and oral historian Studs Terkel. Thanks for listening. Since the dawn of the digital age, creative people, or more generally creators, have been given a raw deal in our 21st century economy. Big tech's spin and greed have rendered most creative professions more passionate sideshows to gain publicity for oneself, as opposed to a paycheck or a living wage. In my own personal journey, I've had to give up working as a journalist for the most part because freelance writing fees are down 90% from what they were 2 decades ago. And no one can survive on such paltry sums, let alone raise a family. Since the dawn of the millennium, we've experienced what late arts journalist and editor Scott Timberg dubbed culture crash in his book of the same name. His subtitle says it all: the killing of the creative class. Enter the brilliant new book, The Death of the Artist: How Creators Are Struggling to Survive in the Age of Billionaires and Big Tech by William Deresiewicz, published by Henry Holt. The Death of the Artist is an astutely reported takedown of the utopian tech charade that most able-minded folks know now has become a disaster for millions of creative professionals. At the heart of Deresiewicz's book is the relationship between money and art. The book's 5 parts unpack through deep reporting of famous and not-so-famous creatives, expounding on the trials and tribulation of making a living in the era of unchecked monopolies and massive deregulation of the media. Unlike Timberg's culture crash, The Death of the Artist does provide some prescriptive advice on how to capitalize and combat this late capitalist shitshow of loss. It can be summed up in his final chapter, Don't Mourn, Organize. The book, I should note, began as a think piece in the Atlantic magazine and was later expanded. Deresiewicz and I caught up recently to discuss this 21st century dilemma at the heart of my career and life and that of most of my friends and colleagues. Here's my conversation with William Deresiewicz. Originally, you wrote an extensive kind of think piece, as they would call them today, about this subject for The Atlantic, and that there was such a great reader response and sort of resonation of that piece that you expanded it into a book-length study of sorts.
Right, and that piece came out 6 years ago. It was at the beginning of 2015. But it was exactly what you just said. It was a think piece, which is to say there was no reporting. It was really kind of cultural criticism is a nice way to put it. Kind of navel-gazing in the sense that I was making conjectures about sort of larger cultural ideas like creative entrepreneurship and what had been happening to the arts. I mean, I think a lot of that piece was valid, but after I wrote it, and after I did hear from a few dozen people across the arts, which suggested that even though I hadn't done any reporting, I was on the right track in some respects. I really then wanted to report it and really find out, like, well, what really is going on in the arts? And when I first formulated the book, I thought it would be more cultural criticism, but just sort of more grounded. And as I got into it, I realized I wanted this to be more concrete. And I zeroed in on a much more practical question that the cultural questions come out of. But the practical question that the book is mainly about is just how are artists managing to make a living now? How are people actually doing it? Like, they must be somehow they're doing it because people are still making art. And there's no single answer. I mean, one answer is that you have money. One answer is you don't have money and it's really hard. You know, you don't make a lot of money and you're barely keeping it together and you never know if this year is going to be your last year. And then, crowdfunding came up a lot, and that's obviously a piece of it. That's one of the few good things that's happened. But But you're right. I mean, the heart of the reporting for me and the heart of the book were these many, over 100 interviews that I did, long interviews with artists of various kinds, musicians and writers and visual artists and people who make film and television, asking them to talk about things that, people don't usually talk about and certainly don't usually ask about, which is like the real financial nitty-gritty, like with actual dollar amounts. And I was really grateful to them. A lot of them were willing to speak to me because they felt it was so important that young artists in particular really get a picture of what the truth is now, and not the kind of gauzy sort of Silicon Valley boosterish, propagandistic, like, the internet, it's great, just put your stuff out there. There's never been a better time.
What I loved about the book was just how much you educate people about what's actually really happening. At one point you say making art takes years of dedication and it requires a means of support. And if things don't change, a lot of art will cease to be sustainable, which is, I think, something that a lot of people are concerned about.
I think that's right. I mean, the whole purpose of this book was to be brutally honest. I mean, I really did have questions. Maybe things were better than I thought. Maybe there was, more of the promise of the digital age. Maybe the young creators I talked to said, "Oh no, but it wasn't like that." I mean, it really was as hard as I thought, and as people have been saying, and in ways that I hadn't even imagined. I mean, one of the problems is that there's never any shortage of artists, right? I mean, I compare this to like the waves at the beach in Normandy on D-Day, right? Like, one wave like storms up the beach and gets cut down, but then there's another wave coming right behind them. So like Brooklyn, or I guess probably certain parts of Los Angeles, are always full of aspiring young artists. And so there's always this enormous amount of art that's being created. So I think there can be a perception that things are okay because, well, they're always artists. But you have to really, that's why you have to really look under the covers and see what's really going on. That it's not a good system. It's not a sustainable system.
At one point you say, we need to stop being childish about this. We need to stop recoiling at the horror, at the mention in connection with art of the terms promotion, cash flow, business model, lawyer. I've had to learn the lesson myself. I was also a purist when I started this project. I was also in denial. That's been my biggest struggle as someone who publishes stuff, is trying to explain to the customer that the reason we're trying to sell everything direct isn't because we love doing all the grunt work of putting the packages together and mailing them into the post office, but that if it goes through the machinations of the 21st century distribution book model, you won't make enough back from the sale of the book after the wholesaler and retailer take their cut than it costs to make the book. And that's the new normal for a lot of physical product.
Yeah, and physical products were supposed to be one of the things that saved us from digital demonetization. But that's exactly right. I mean, that I would say is the biggest difference between the way the book came out and that initial piece in The Atlantic 6 years ago. Because I did write that initial piece, which, like I said, was still very kind of just me gazing at my navel and kind of thinking about things in the abstract. I was still in that position of the purist, of the person who thought that an artist who thought about money was necessarily a sellout, that any kind of interaction with the market contaminated art. And it was because of the interviews I started to do. There was actually one in particular with an independent film director who gave me a very frank interview, so much so that he asked me to quote him under a pseudonym in the book. But he really turned my head around, and he said, "Look, you're part of the problem at this point. That piece was written from the perspective of a kind of mythology that really hampers artists from making their way, especially younger artists, because they absorb this message. A lot of them absorb it in art school, in film school, because their professors are completely removed from economic reality, and they can preach this kind of gospel of you must be a purist without talking about the economic realities, the economic substrate that has always undergirded artists. I was going to say has always in the age of the market and capitalism, but even before then, there was always some way that art was being supported. So maybe before that it was aristocratic patronage. But we have to stop kidding ourselves about this because it doesn't help. It only hurts. It hurts individual artists and their ability to make a living. And as you were saying, it hurts our ability to come to the audience and say, like, this is why we need you to pay for things. This is why it's bad that everything is free and you think you're getting something for nothing, but it's actually really hurting.
You mentioned this in one of the chapters, is that there's this loss of the middle class artist idea, which I think, is something that's maybe only a 20th century phenomenon, but that there was this sort of upward mobility of the middle class, which has proven to be the complete opposite in the last 25, 30 years of so-called globalization, late capitalism, whatever we want to call it. But this it becomes a class thing, and you get into this and you have some great people talking about it from both ends of the spectrum. That, do we really want to go back to a second Gilded Age, as you just mentioned, aristocratic patronage for the arts? I mean, do we really want to have to go back to the time of Baudelaire to have the arts properly supported? That's the argument I try to make when trying to raise money for things on our end as to why this stuff should be supported, even if there's not a crazy return on investment the way there would be for, say, a tech company.
Yes, I mean, the loss of the middle is so important to talk about. There's an idea that artists are necessarily starving, struggling artists, and certainly many artists have been, and that's long been true. But in the decades before the internet came along, I would say probably since around the end of World War II to the end of the 20th century, we created systems that enabled artists who were successful, not superstars, but the minority of artists who managed to establish serious, sustained artistic careers where they were producing regularly, had achieved some kind of institutional or critical affirmation, had an audience, had the respect of their peers. Everyday working artists in the middle tier, that was a middle-class job description. In other words, you could live decently. You could afford a decent place to live. You could send your kids to college. You could not have to work yourself to death. You could, take a vacation every once in a while. And that is as it should be. I think it was also, in many ways, a great age for art in the 50s, 60s, 70s. I mean, there's a lot of great art produced then, and I think it was to a great extent because of that financial support. And now all of that is disappearing.
Well, you have this great line in there, which I'll read back to you. You say, artists are routinely asked, it is one of the banes of the creative life in the 21st century to work for nothing, or for, quote, exposure, which is a synonym for nothing.
Right. Yeah. I mean, this is the problem. And let me also say, people will use that as an argument. In other words, they'll say, well, throughout history, musicians haven't been able to sell recorded music. I mean, like, that was a blip. Being able to make money from recorded music was a blip. It's like, yeah, okay, you're right. Nobody was making money from recorded music in the 16th century because there wasn't any recorded music. But it's not like recorded music has gone away. In fact, I got an email from a musician last week who made exactly this point. He said, people say, we just have to go back to being troubadours again, where we're going to make all our money from live performance. Yeah, but we have to compete with recorded music. The troubadours didn't. Live performance was the only way that you could hear music. So, you can make a living that way. Now you have to compete with recorded music. It's not like it's gone away. And I would add to that it's not like, quote unquote, free recorded music, demonetized content, isn't very lucrative. I mean, the tech companies are making a fortune from it. So it's still generating a lot of money. It's not generating it for musicians.
Yeah, I couldn't believe some of the statistics that you had unearthed in some of your reporting, that even 1 million downloads on Spotify nets the artist between $900 and $7,000 or something crazy, when, if you would just sell maybe 1,000 LPs on the road, you could probably make that same amount of money. And so there needs to be a practical solution for how do we move forward? How do musicians make money in this new age that's not going to change? How do authors that are mid-list authors figure out how to get an advance that isn't paltry or pitiful to the point where they can't even block the time to write the book? I don't think anyone has the answers, but you certainly, I think, spent enough time thinking about this. Are you hopeful that, that all of the arts can come out of this okay if they take the right path?
I wouldn't exactly say that I'm hopeful, maybe because I'm not hopeful by nature, and maybe because the task is so huge, and just pointing to what could be done doesn't mean that it will be done. But I don't think I'm not hopeless either. I think fundamentally what has to happen is that, and not just because of the arts, is that we as a society need to take on the tech companies. Their power has gotten so vast, and their destructive behavior in so many industries has gotten so pervasive and so extreme that it's killing off a lot of great things in new business creation is way down. Entrepreneurship, despite what we like to think of ourselves, is way down. New entrants can't compete in more and more markets because the tech giants are just dominating them. The reason to be hopeful is that we're actually starting to talk about that now, and more than just talk about it. I mean, just in the last 6 months, maybe a year and 6 months, there have been various moves beginning to try to rein in the monopoly power of the tech industries. The antitrust action, the House Judiciary released a big report about all four of the big platforms, including Apple, Amazon, Google, Facebook. I think that's ultimately the main thing that needs to happen, so that this market that's gotten so completely unbalanced, where all these millions of artists are creating things of value, and the audience, it's things that the audience wants, and yet the money for it isn't going back to them. I mean, an infinitesimal fraction is going back to them, as you pointed out, like with Spotify streaming rates or YouTube streaming rates, even worse. It's a broken market, and when a market is broken, government has to intervene. It seems like maybe we're beginning to move in that direction. I think it's going to take a long time. Antitrust action always does take a long time, and we'll have to see where we are when we come out at the other end. And then beyond that, I mean, we talked about the destruction of the middle, but of course there's been a destruction of the middle everywhere, not just in the arts. And there are larger things that need to happen to help rebuild the middle class, including addressing these unsustainable costs of basic needs: education, especially college education, healthcare, and housing. If those things weren't so expensive, people in the arts could go back to what I think is a really good model, which is the Bohemian model, which preceded World War II, roughly from maybe the early 19th century to the early mid-20th century, where you can keep yourself more or less distant from the market or just dip your toe in the market as needed, because you can live cheaply. You can work a part-time minimum wage job, and because the cost of living is so low, as it was even in places like New York City, like San Francisco, that you could make your art, and you can make the art that you want to make and not the art that the culture industry wants you to make, or engage in the kind of production that the new models involve, like crowdfunding, where you're constantly, if you're on Patreon, you constantly have to churn out new material for your supporters. If you're an artist a visual artist who's trying to make a name for yourself, you might post work on Instagram every day. This is not a recipe for making good art.
The best laughed out loud moment for me was when you have this Fran Lebowitz quote where she says, "Your chances of winning the lottery are the same whether you buy a ticket or not." And,
Right.
and we want to move away from a culture where those are the odds. And and this makes people tend to think that maybe capitalism isn't the answer, because if this is the end result, then where are we really going?
Right. Well, I don't know that I would describe myself as a capitalist, but I do think I'm not anti-capitalist in the way that I used to be, because I think the market plays an important role. The market helps, as I say in the book, it helps transmit signals of desire. In other words, it tells us what people want. If we had a centrally planned system, there would be, we wouldn't have those signals, and those kinds of economies do not have a great track record. The important thing, the thing that has to happen, is that we can't just let the market sort of follow its own logic, because we know, Marx himself talked about this 150 plus years ago, that capitalism left to itself tends towards monopoly. I think the titans of Silicon Valley and the would-be titans, whatever their professions about how they want to make the world a better place. I don't believe that. They want to get filthy rich. They see other people getting filthy rich. A lot of them are Ayn Randians, not just in the sense of having these megalomaniacal egos, but in being hardcore libertarians who don't believe there should be any government. I mean, Peter Thiel is like that. Elon Musk, I believe, is like that. There are others who are like that. But that's them. We cannot let that vision of the future and of society dominate society. And we have to say, a lot of what you're doing is very productive and positive, and we like the products you're making, but a lot of the consequences are also really negative, and it's profoundly anti-democratic. So it's a matter of political will ultimately. But I do think that attitudes have changed a great deal about this in the last 5 years. When I think of sort of the tech icon who was really worshipped as this great genius and this great benefactor, I think of Steve Jobs. I don't think that's the image that people have anymore of someone like Bezos or Zuckerberg. I think they're seen as malevolent. I think they're seen as Bond villains. And we're recognizing now that they have way too much power and that the fruits of what they've created are in many ways poison fruits. I mean, there's that book, The Social Dilemma, that got a lot of attention, and people are beginning to understand, and there have been a lot of books about this, what the internet is doing to our psyches, what the internet is doing to our minds, what it's doing to our politics. My piece of that in this book is the arts, and I want people to pay some attention to that too. I think the arts are much, much more important to people than the amount of time they give to thinking about the actual arts economy, right? People value education, and so they value teachers, and they think that teachers should be well paid, even if they aren't. They value health care, so they value doctors and nurses, and they think nurses should get paid well, even if they're not. People value the arts. I mean, they spend several hours a day probably listening to music, reading, watching television. They don't value artists. There was a striking study by the Urban Institute. I'm not sure why the Urban Institute did this, but they did a survey. It's from back in, I think, 2002, where they asked people, 97% of respondents say that the arts contribute a lot to society. 97%. 26% said that artists do, which is this bizarre disconnect, right? But that's where we are. And I think, one of the reasons I wrote the book is to raise people's consciousness about this and to try to change that attitude.
The Death of the Artist, How Creators Are Struggling to Survive in the Age of Billionaires and Big Tech by William Deresiewicz, published by Henry Holt, is available now. For the reading this episode, the author, William Deresiewicz, will read from The Death of the Artist.
Being an artist, people might argue, has always been hard. But for whom exactly has it been hard? For younger artists who are still trying to establish themselves, for artists who aren't very good, of whom there's never a shortage, for those who are good, but who never manage to find an audience, to find success. The difference now is that it's hard even if you do find success, reach listeners or readers, win the respect of critics and peers, work steadily and full-time in the field. I spoke about these matters with Ian Mackay. I know plenty of filmmakers, he said, who poured their heart and soul and all their money into projects long before the internet, who lost their fucking ass because not enough people wanted to see their movie. And that is as it should be. The problem now is that you often lose your fucking ass, even if enough people do want to see your movie, read your novel, listen to your music. Being an artist has always been hard, but there is hard and hard. How hard matters. How hard affects how much you get to do your art. as opposed to grinding at your day job, and therefore how good you become, as well as how much you're able to make. How hard affects who gets to do it in the first place. The less you can earn from your art, the more you must rely on other sources of support, like mommy and daddy. The less money there is in the arts overall, the more they become a rich kid's game. The idea that people will do it anyway, that if you're a real artist, you'll make art no matter what, can be the product only of naivete or ignorance or privilege. If many of us are oblivious to the plight of artists in the contemporary economy, there is an obvious reason for that. Not only is there a lot of art being made, there is much, much more of it at lower cost than ever. For consumers of art, there really hasn't ever been a better time, at least not if you equate quantity with quality, or do not worry over much about the workers at the other end of the supply chain. First we had fast food, then we had fast fashion, now we have fast art. Fast music, fast writing, fast video, photography, design, and illustration, made cheaply and consumed in haste. We can gorge ourselves to our heart's content. How nourishing these products are, and how sustainable the systems that create them, are questions that we need to ask ourselves.
To support Big Table, go to bigtablepodcast.org/bookshop. You can help us and independent bookstore culture at the same time. Big Table is produced and presented by Hat and Beard Press, Dub Lab, and Gold Diggers in Los Angeles, and is supported by Invisible Republic, a nonprofit arts organization based in Chicago, New York, and Los Angeles. You can learn more about their community-based programs and publications at invisiblerepublic.org. Big Table would not exist in the audio world without the expert skill sets, friendship, and dedication of sound designer and editor Matea Bain and audio engineer Jacob Ross. Special thanks to Eric Gorman at Gold Diggers and Alejandro Ali Cohen at Dub Lab for early encouragement and engineering prowess. Thanks again for listening.